How you doing there? Welcome back to Babble on Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Hey, Daf 95, Masechta Menachos. Friends, on Daf 95, 3 sections. First one, the status of the Lechem Hapanim while on the road. Of course, when the Yidden were sojourning in the wilderness, from time to time, they hit the road. How many places? It's the beginning of Parshas Maseh. The beginning of Parshas Maseh lists all the places that the Yidden went. But I think that many of those travels, many of those stops along the way were within like short clusters of time. The point being, I think that there were long periods of staying in one place, and then they would kind of be on the road for a bit. So when the Yidden were on the road and they packed up the Mishkan, so what became of the Lechem Hapanim? What became of any Kachei Kachim, right? Meaning things that were dependent on there being a Mishkan. What happened when the Yidden were on the road in the wilderness? Section number 1. Number 2, what happens to zavs and metzoras, right? Of course, when the camp is set up and you have the Mishkan, which is Machne Shechina, surrounded by the Levim, which is Machne Levia, surrounded by that is Machne Yisrael. So then you can have metzoras, of course, right? The week's Parsha, right? Michutz LaMachane. He's got to be sent outside of all of the camps. And a Zav, for example, is allowed in the Machne Yisrael, but not the other ones. Tmei Meis is allowed in Machne Levia, but not Machne Shechina, etc. So when the Mishkan, which is Machne Shechina, is packed up, and they're on the road, what happens to certain people who are allowed into certain camps? When one of the camps is packed up, what happens to the status of the other camps in terms of who's allowed into them? And finally, we get to a new Mishnah where the Lechem Hapanim is prepared. Interesting question. Does it have to be prepared in the Azara or not? Friends, this is what we have to look forward to on Daf Hey, Daf 95, Masechta Menachos. Friends, let's jump in. Here we go. We begin on Daf Hey, Amud Aleph of Masechta Menachos, about 6 or 7 lines into the Amud Ibayalu. They ask a kasha Lechem Hapanim nifsul b'masos, and nifsul b'masos, the showbreads, the Lechem Hapanim. Of course, every Shabbos, the Lechem Hapanim would be swapped, would be put into the shulchan, and the previous week's Lechem Hapanim would be removed from the shulchan and consumed and eaten. Now, the pasuk in Parshas Emor says that what does it say? What does it say? I think it says v'achlu osam b'makom kadosh. If I'm not mistaken, that's what it says. That the Lechem Hapanim needs to be eaten in the Azara Be'etzah. It's kachei kachin. Needs to be eaten in the Azara, and in terms of the Mishkan, that is essentially the Mishkan. It needs to be in, the Mishkan was there was no frills in the Mishkan. It was a mobile Beis Hamikdash. There was no Har Abayis. You walked in, you were right in the Azara. That's where the avoda was happening. That's where the Mizbeach was. So when the Mishkan is packed up and the curtains are taken down, and there isn't this Mishkan to go into to eat the Lechem Hapanim, so what happens to the Lechem Hapanim? Does it now become possible? Because there's no Mishkan in it? What happens? It's an interesting question, right? We always read about in the Chumash about the Yidden were sojourning in the wilderness, and they would pack up and they would go from place to place. But there are nafkaminas, as we talk about it in the introduction, right? There are things that are dependent on there being a Mishkan, in terms of who's allowed into which camps, and the structures of having Machne Shechina, Machne Levia, Machne Yisrael, different korbanos that could be in different places. What happens when they're on the road to all these things that are dependent on there being sort of this structure at the center of which is the tabernacle? The tabernacle is now packed up. So when it comes to the showbreads, nifsul b'masos and nifsul b'masos, do they become pasul when the Yidden are on the road or not? I.e., are they kosher Do they remain kosher when the Yidden are on the road, or do they become possible when the Yidden are on the road? It's a machlokes. Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, Chad Omer nifsol, Chad Omer eino nifsol. One opinion is possible, the other one is not possible. However, there's going to be some double negatives on this stuff. I think probably what I'm going to do is I'm going to just explain them positively, if that's okay. If I think it's not okay, I'll just say not possible, but I prefer to say kosher, as you know. So one opinion is kosher, one opinion is possible. Okay. Manda Amar Nifsol. According to the opinion who says possible, the pasuk says kasher yachnu ken yisayu. That the pasuk says that as the Yidden were encamped, when they were settled, when they were in one place, they would encamp. As they were encamped, so would they travel. Just like when the Yidden were encamped, the Lechem Hapanim would be pasul biyotze, right? They have to be eaten in the tabernacle, within the walls of, what did I call them? Did I call them curtains? I can't remember. Within the walls of the tabernacle. So, and if they leave the walls of the tabernacles, so then the Lechem Hapanim would be pasul. So af b'nisiyoso nifsol b'yotze. So the same applies when the Yidden are on the road and the tabernacle has been packed up. There no longer are the walls of the tabernacle. So memele the Lechem Hapanim becomes pasul. Mandamar eino nifsol. According to the opinion who says that the Lechem Hapanim remains kasher. Because the pasuk says v'lechem hatamid olav yiyeh. I'm going to read you that whole pasuk. The pasuk that is the final few words of a pasuk that reads, and I'm reading the pasuk now. Val shulchan hapanim. Right. This is talking about when the Yidden would pack up. When the Yidden were packing up to hit the road, it says val shulchan hapanim, the shulchan yifresu beged tcheles. Basically, they would go to the shulchan, and the shulchan was stacked with breads at the time. Right, let's assume they left on a Sunday, and already the day before, the shulchan was stacked with breads, and now it's time to pack up the camp, and they need to pack up the shulchan. So they leave the breads, they leave the showbreads on the shulchan. And they cover the shulchan with a garment of tcheles. Hakaris v'sakapis, it's amnakis v'sosanosech. Then they put all the kalim of the shulchan on top of the tcheles covering. And then it says after that then they cover that with a crimson cover. Okay. V'lechem hatamid olav yiyeh. And the lechem hatamid are on the shulchan. So interestingly, the pasuk refers to the lechem hapanim, which remain on the shulchan. They just cover up the. They take some kind of a blue tcheles covering. They cover the shulchan with the lechem hapanim on it, and that is how they travel. That is how they transport the shulchan to the next destination with the lechem hapanim on it. And the pasuk calls them in this context, in the context of the travels. The pasuk refers to the lechem hapanim as the lechem hatamid. The implication being that even during this experience, even during the travel from place to place, they are still referred to as the lechem hatamid, the constant bread, the bread that constantly, even during transit, that remains the lechem hapanim, it remains kosher. Right, so, okay. So according to the one who says that it's kosher, the pasuk says, v'lechem hatamid, all of yid, in the context of traveling, the pasuk nonetheless refers to the lechem hapanim as the lechem hatamid. That it remains kasher. But according to the Mandama who says kosher, what does he do with the pasuk of kasher yachnu ken yiso, from which we had learned earlier that just like when they're encamped, if it leaves the azara, it's possible. When they travel, also, if it leaves the azara, it's possible. And of course, it leaves the azara because there is no azara. The azara is packed up. So the idach gisa, no big deal. the Mandamer says kosher, he will just explain that pasuk in the following way. Yes, it's true. We compare when they were encamped to when they were traveling, and we say ki lo yatsa mimakomo lo mifsal. That is a double negative that I will positive. Just like when they are encamped, so long as the bread remains on the shulchan, it remains kasher, right? Ki lo yatsa mimakomo. As long as it hasn't left its place, i.e., as long as it remains where it belongs, as long as the breads remain on the shulchan, lo mifsal. It's not possible. It's kosher. So long as the breads remain on the shulchan, it is kosher. So Apnisi also will say the same thing when they are in transit. Ki lo yatsa mimakomo lo mifsal. So the same thing when they're in transit, so long as the Lechem Hapanim remain on the shulchan, right? And as we described from the pasuk, that they just take a tcheles cloth, garment, cover it over the shulchan with the breads on it, and so long as the breads remain on the shulchan, the breads remain kasher, just like when they are encamped. Keep the breads on the shulchan, the breads remain kasher. Now, according to the Manda Amr who says pasul, how does he explain the pasuk that explicitly refers to the showbreads in the context of traveling as the lechem hatamid? Does that not imply that they remain constantly kasher even during the travels? Elikyoser of Dimi, so that is a fair question. And a question that the Mandamur says pasul does not answer. Rather, we give a different explanation to this whole machlokas. I hope I said that right. According to the Mandamur says pasul, they're unable to answer that question about referring to the breads nonetheless as the lechem hatamid. So now, Elikyoser of Dimi, when Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael to Babble, Omar, he says, b'mesuder d'chuli amale pligei. Okay, givaldik. So Rav Dimi comes from Eretz Yisrael to Babble, and he explains that in terms of when the breads are on the shulchan, lo pligei, no machlokas. Everyone is in agreement in that case. When the shulchan is packed up with the showbreads on it, yep, you're right. The pasuk refers to the showbreads in that state as the lechem hatamid. They remain the showbreads. You take a garment of tcheles, you cover the shulchan with the showbreads on it, you hit the road, the showbreads remain the lechem hatamid, they remain kosher. Everyone is on the same page about that. Ela ki plige b'misulik. Where they disagree is when the showbreads have been removed. When are the showbreads removed? On Shabbos. Let's say it's Shabbos, and they swap out last week's showbreads for the new showbreads, and the Kohanim eat the showbreads that have been removed. Okay. Now it's Motzei Shabbos, and the Anon Yakovod begin moving. And it's time to travel. It's time to hit the road. And they haven't yet finished eating these ginormous showbreads, right? We had said each one is 86.4 eggs worth of flour. That's like, and there's 12 of them. That's like, sheesh. That's like, oh boy. That's like 1,000 eggs worth of flour. That's a lot of flour. These are big breads. They haven't finished eating them. It's Motzei Shabbos. They haven't yet finished eating the breads. The Anonei HaKavod start moving. Start rumbling their engines. And okay. So they pack up the Mishkan and all the Yidden start traveling. What happens to the Lechem Hapanim then? There's no longer a Mishkan. It's been packed up. And does that mean that the showbreads automatically become pasul now? That's the machlokes. That's where we have a machlokes. In terms of breads that have been removed from in terms of the breads that are on the table, everyone agrees, lechem hatamid, yeah, it remains kosher. The question is, what about breads that have been removed from the shulchan, and now the yidden hit the road? What happens to them? Manda Omar Nifsol, according to the Manda Omar, says, Pasul Dichsiv Kashi Achnu Keniso. Well, because it says, we compare the encampment to the travel. Just just like when they are encamped, if the showbreads are taken out of the Ohel Moed, out of the Mishkan, they are apostle. Here also, the breads are outside of the Mishkan has been packed up, so they become apostle. L'manda Omer, Eino Nifsal, according to the opinion who says that they are kosher, Dichsiv V'nosa Ohel Moed, because the pasuk says that the Ohel Moed travels. Afalpisha Nosa Ohel Moedu, that we, even while they are traveling, we still refer to the Ohel Moed as the Ohel Moed, as if it was in the same way we refer to it as when it's set up. And that's to say that we're going to reject this. We're going to reject. If you have questions on this, it's a questionable answer. However, the Gemara says that even when the Yidden are on the road, it's the Ohel Moed, and if it's the Ohel Moed, you can eat the Lechem Hapanim. There's the Ohel Moed, and I guess it's considered like you're in it. I think Rashi says as long as you're in the Machne Leviyah, you would be considered in the Ohel Moed. Okay, fine. Even when the Ohel Moed is packed up and they're on the road, it's still considered like there's an Ohel Moed, and the Lechem Hapanim would remain kasher. We would not treat it like they left and were possibly Yosef. Idach Nam Yaksiv Kasher Yachnu Ken Yiso. Now, according to the opinion who says that they remain kasher, what about kasher yachanu ken yiso? That haven't they left the azara? So the idach gisa, well, they will explain ma b'chanayoso kilo mapik le lo mifsil af b'nisyoso kilo mapik le lo mifsil. Okay, well, just like when they were encamped, as long as he didn't take it out of the azara, it's kosher. Here also, I guess because we're saying kasher yachnu v'nosa Ohel Moed, that the Ohel Moed is traveling, and it's like there's still an Ohel Moed, and therefore it's not considered like they left Hazar and remains kosher. Okay, a little bit tricky over there. What does Rashi say? It's kind of a funny thing, but we're going to reject it. We're going to reject it. It's a little bit difficult to explain. Anyways, it's going to be rejected. Bidach nami. According to the opinion it says kosher. According to the opinion it says pasul. What is it with V'nosa Ohel Moed, right? That even when they're traveling, the Ohel Moed is still intact, considered. So that the opinion who says pasul says no. That V'nosa Ohel Moed is to teach that they traveled in their encampments. Meaning, if we look at that pasuk, right? What is the pasuk? I'm going to read you the whole pasuk. V'nosa Ohel Moed. The Ohel Moed traveled. Machne Alevim, B'socha Machnos. And the Machne Alevim, within the camps, Kasher Yachnu Ken Yiso, as they encamped, so they traveled. Ish Ayado L'Digleim, with their flags, right? The way that the encampment was set up in the wilderness was that the centerpiece, at the middle of it all, was the tabernacle, was the Mishkan. Surrounding the Mishkan was the Machne Leviyah. That's where the Leviyim were. And around that were all of the different shvatim, all the different tribes. And what the pasuk is saying is that in the same setup of where you had the Levim in the middle and the tribes surrounding them, that's how they were when they were in camp. That is also how they traveled. And that's what it's saying. V'nosa Ohel Moed, Machne Levim, etc. We're not learning out V'nosa Ohel Moed, some drasha that even when they were traveling, it was still considered like there was an Ohel Moed intact and everything's kosher. No. It's just saying that they traveled in their encampments. They preserved their encampments as they traveled. Whereas the opinion who says that the Lechem Hapanim remain kosher learns that out from the next words, that the Machne Levim was in the middle of the Machne, which means that if they kept their place in the middle, and all the other tribes were surrounded. Okay, fine. Things are getting a little bit. I'm clearly not explaining things extremely clearly. Things are a bit fuzzy. I think Tosfos maybe even asked. I don't even remember. But and anyways, we are. I think Tosfos asked somewhere. I don't even remember where I saw this. I don't know what I'm even referring to, but like somehow I think this is related to the fact that it's ultimately I think it was maybe even Tosfos in Zvachim or something referred to this Gemara, and I think said that it's ultimately rejected. Anyways, fine. We're moving on. Meisvei, we have a contradiction that's going to set our path straighter and clearer. B'shas siluk masos kochim nifsalim biyotze. That's the contradiction. The contradiction is that we have a brisa. Is it even a tosefta? A tosefta in Masechta Zvachim. And the tosefta in Masechta Zvachim says that when the Yidden were traveling and they were on the road, all kodshe kodshim became pasul. That when the tabernacle, when the Mishkan was packed up, you no longer have the walls of the Ohel Moed, of the tabernacle. Well, the Ohel Moed, I think the Ohel Moed would probably actually be the Kodesh, but you don't have the Mishkan was packed up, and therefore you don't have the walls of the you don't have the curtains of the Mishkan anymore, and you can't eat if you had a korban chatas that you needed to eat in the Mishkan. The Mishkan's packed up; it becomes pasul. The question being, we have a brisa saying that kodshe kodshim become pasul when the Yidden are on the road. Lechem Hapanim, therefore, should have the same halacha. That the Lechem Hapanim, which has to be eaten in the Mishkan, should then also become pasul. Again, Meisvei, we have a question, B'shas siluk masos, that when the Yidden were on the road, kodshim nifsalin, kodshe kodshim become pasul because they have to be eaten in the Mishkan, and the Mishkan is packed up. Nifsalim biyotze, they become yotze biyotze because the memele outside of the Mishkan, because the Mishkan is packed up. V'zavinu mitzorayin mishtalchen chutz l'mechitzasan, which is a shtickle chiddush, that even though we're saying that the Mishkan is packed up, and therefore memele all kodshe kodshim are pasul biyotze, we don't have the Mishkan, it's packed up. Even so, however, you can argue that, well, if the Mishkan is packed up, and effectively machne shchina is packed up, and you have tumah and tara, that you have, for example, a metzora needs to be outside of all three camps. The zavs need to be outside of the machne shchina and machne levia, but they could be in machne Yisrael. Tmei mesim have to be outside of the machne shchina, but they could be in machne levia, etc. But if we no longer have machne shchina, I could, right, because the machne shchina is the Mishkan. The Mishkan's been packed up. I could say, well, then kind of everything falls apart. We don't have the structure of the machne shchina, machne levia, machne Yisrael. We don't have these three camps anymore. So therefore, maybe people who have been, the metzora who was sent outside of all three camps, there aren't three camps anymore, and therefore they're allowed back in with everybody else. Now that there's no longer, machne shchina has been packed up. However, nonetheless, even though we say there's no longer a machne shchina to the extent that any kodshim become pasul, we still do say that the metzora needs to stay out, and that the zavs are allowed into machne Yisrael, but are still not allowed into machne levia. There's a shtickle chiddush where we say even though the machne shchina is not there and kodshim bar pasul, nonetheless the zavs need to remain outside. The zavs and metzoras need to stay outside of where they need to stay outside of. So again, nonetheless, my love, I feel lechem hapanim. So, let's conclude. Let's extrapolate. Let's what's the word I'm thinking of? I don't know. Let's do the thing that the Gemara does and say that, well, if the kodshe, the Mishkan's been packed up, and we're saying memela kodshe kodshim are therefore pasul biyotze, there's no longer a Mishkan, therefore the memela outside of the Mishkan and kodshe kodshim are pasul biyotze. The same should apply to lechem hapanim, which also need to be in the Mishkan. No, bar mi lechem hapanim. This doesn't apply to lechem hapanim. Mapitom, it doesn't apply to lechem hapanim. We have to be consistent. We have to have rules here that make sense. Manavshach. I oil mayed davkeu. If we're saying this drasha of, well, even when you're traveling, there's an oil moed, and therefore the lechem hapanim are kosher. Afilu kachim nami. Well, then we'd have to say that the kachim are also kosher, but we don't say that. And the oil moed lav davka. If we say that no, when we say that v'nosa oil moed, and even when the oil moed is traveling, Not really, and therefore the kachei kachim are going to be considered pasul biyotze. Safilu lechem hapanim nami. Well, then lechem hapanim is also going to have to be pasul biyotze. We have to be consistent here. If things that need to be eaten in the azara are pasul when they're on the road, that would apply to kachei kachim and to lechem hapanim. If they're pasul, if they're kosher, also it would apply to both of them. Elo, rather, Kesser of Ravin, Omar, when Ravin came, he says, look, there's actually no machlokas here. Mar Omar b'misuder, Umar Omar b'misulik v'lo plige. They're talking about different things. They argue. Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Shua ben Levi, I'm sorry, I don't know what I just said. They're talking about different things, and they agree. They don't argue. They agree. Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Shua ben Levi, they agree. They're just talking about two different things. They both agree that when the bread is mesudar, when the bread is on the shulchan, like we talked about at the beginning, it's called the Lechem Hapanim. That when they travel and the bread is on the shulchan, that bread is kosher. Both Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Shua ben Levi agree with that. And they also both agree that any bread that has been removed from the shulchan is going to be pasul, just like kachei kachim are pasul. So when one of them says kosher, one of them says pasul, talking about two different things. Kosher is the breads on the shulchan. Pasul is the breads that are not on the shulchan. They become pasul biyotze. Omar Abaye says Abaye shmamino yesh siluk masos balayla. So it says Abaye, we can conclude from here that they would travel at night. Because if you said that they would not kick off a travel, they would not hit the road at night. Emas medale. Well, then when would they be packing up the Mishkan? Litzafra, the next morning, Sunday morning. Ma'iri mishum yotze typically the ifsele belina. Right, we're talking about, are the Lechem Hapanim going to be pasul biyotze? Are the Lechem Hapanim going to be pasul biyotze? Well, first of all, we're talking about, we said, when the Lechem Hapanim are on the table, there's nothing to talk about. It's the Lechem Hatamid. It's all good. When the Lechem Hapanim have been removed from, now, when are the Lechem Hapanim removed from the Shulchan? On Shabbos. They're not traveling on Shabbos. And by the next morning, there would be pasul belina. Not exactly sure why, but they would be pasul belina by the next morning. So when would they be pasul biyotze? Again, they're not traveling on Shabbos. And if they start traveling the next day, the breads are pasul for, the lechem hapanim are pasul for a different reason, because of lina. So it must be, when are they pasul biyotze? If they start traveling Motzei Shabbos that night. And then when they hit the road, what happens to these lechem hapanim that they took off of the shulchan earlier? What happens to the lechem hapanim when they hit the road? Do they become pasul biyotze or not? And we're saying that they do become pasul. So they must. The fact that they become pasul because of yotze specifically must mean that they are traveling at night. Why did I say that? I'm not sure why they become pasul belina. I don't know. I'm just not sure why. Right, because after all, right, we say about the Lechem Hapanim that, first of all, that as we're going to see in the Mishnah soon, in a few minutes, Lechem Hapanim are prepared before Shabbos, on Friday. It's a machlekes, but anyways, prepared before Shabbos, let's assume. Which means that it's not being pasul belina between Friday night and Shabbos when they are put on the Lechem Hapanim, on the Shulchan. Then they are put on the Shulchan, they stay there the whole week. They're not becoming pasul belina all week. What changed that now, come Sunday morning, they should be pasul belina? For the past 8 days, night after night, they remained kosher. What changed? What changed? I'm not sure. Is it possible that maybe, maybe that's what it is. Oh. Maybe that's taka what it is. It could be that the burning of the frankincense is mekadesh the lechem hapanim. I have a feeling that that's what it is. Meaning the burning of the frankincense is matir the lechem hapanim. Now you can eat them. You have to first burn the frankincense, then you can eat it. It's possible. I have to find it. It's possible that I don't know, how else would you explain it? It's possible that the burning of the frankincense is not just matir the lechem hapanim, it could be it's also mekadesh the lechem hapanim. And now that it's kadosh, so then it will become possible lina. Maybe that's what it is. I have to find it. I'd have to find it somewhere. Akopanim. Okay. So where are we? Okay, so Abai says that we can therefore extrapolate. Maybe that's what I was looking for earlier. We can extrapolate from the fact that we're saying that the Lechem Hapanim are pasul b'yotze, but not pasul b'lina, and they're also not traveling on Shabbos. The only time that they could have kicked off their journey, hit the road, would have been Motzai Shabbos. So we see that they could hit the road at night. Pshita, that's obvious. Laleches yom v'layla ksiv. In the first aliyah of Parshas B'Shalach, the Rabban Shalom says how there is the Amud Ha'anon by Laleches Yoma. Do I have the? Yeah, here it is. Vashem Hoylech Lifneim Yomam, that the Rabban Shalom walked before the Yidden during the day, Ba'amud Anon, with a cloud during the day. Lanchosim Aderech, to guide them. V'layla, and at night, Ba'amud Eish L'hoyer Loyim, and at night there was fire. Laleches Yomam V'layla, and that way they could walk day and night. So it's Pasha, it's a pasuk in Chumash. The pasuk says they could travel at night. No, that could be dafka, meaning once they're already on the road, they're not going to stop. They don't need to stop every night. Sure, there's the Amura Eish, they could travel at night as well. However, the question is not can they continue traveling at night, can they start traveling at night? That's the question. All right. Maybe you have to kick off the journey during the day, and once you kicked off the journey during the day, so then as the pasuk says, they can continue walking at night. I may have thought though that you wouldn't be able to kick off the journey at night. So Kamash Malum, what Abaye is saying is that we see from the fact that there's this whole question of the fact that we say, Poshit, that the Lechem Hapanim become pasul biyotze. The only time when the Lechem Hapanim would be able to specifically become pasul biyotze would be if they kicked off the journey at night. So we see that in fact they are allowed to kick off the journey at night on Motzai Shabbos. For a mini, we however have a contradiction. A contradiction to what? A contradiction to the fact that we said that even while the Yidden are traveling and there is no Mishkan, the Mishkan's been packed up, and therefore all Kodshei Kodshim and the Lechem Hapanim become pasul biyotze memela, and there's no Machne Shechina anymore. We said nonetheless, metzoras need to stay even outside of Machne Yisrael. Zavs need to stay out of Machne Levia. But we have a contradiction. Huglalu aparochis, that when they roll up and they take down the Mishkan essentially, hutru azavin mutzor and likanis l'sham. The different camps essentially break down, and the different rules about who's allowed in what camp breaks down. And once they pack up the Mishkan and the Machne Shechina is packed up, zavs and metzoras are allowed back in to the camp. Zavs are allowed. Yeah, they're allowed back in, right? They were outside of all the camps, they're allowed back in. Everybody's allowed back in once the Mishkan is packed up. Ravashi Lokasha or Beliezer or Rabbanan. Ravashi says, okay, it's a machlekes tak. Saka machlekes. When the Machne Shechina was packed up, when the Mishkan was packed up, were Zavin and Metzoras allowed back into the camp? It's taka a machlekes Rabbi Eliezer and the Rabbanan decided that we learned in a Baraisa. Rabbi Eliezer says, Rabbi Eliezer, Yochol dochaku zavin u'mitzorayin v'nichmesu la'azar b'paisich abba b'tuma yochol yuchayovin tamloma v'yishalchu min ha'machne kol tzorah v'chol zav v'chol tamid l'nefesh b'shoshe tmei mesim mishtachin zav mitzorayin mishtachin ein tmei mesim mishtachin ein zav mitzorayin mishtachin chevre Pesach abba b'tuma. As we learned about Masechta Psachin, that if the majority of Am Yisrael is Tmei Mesim, specifically Tmei Mesim, Tuma Hutra B'tzibor is by Tmei Mesim, Tuma Sames, not Tuma Ziva or Mitzora. So if the majority of Am Yisrael is Tmei Mes, so nonetheless, they bring the Korban Pesach B'tuma. Which means that you have all these Yidden coming into the Azara to offer their Korban Pesach and they're tamei. Because if the majority of Am Yisrael is tamei, they offer the Korban Pesach nonetheless. Now that is tumas hameis, however. What if now you have a whole bunch of zavs and metzoras, and they say, givaldig, we're also going to go to the Azara and, I don't know, participate in the Korban Pesach, but the question, they're not allowed to come to the Azara, because the only thing that was allowed was tumas hameis. The majority of Am Yisrael is tamei tumas hameis, they can bring the Korban Pesach. That has no nafkamina for zavs and metzoras. However, but what if zavs and metzoras forced their way, and they went into the Azar, on a year when, right, if there was a time when the majority of Am Yisrael was tamei, and therefore you have tamei people offering the Korban Pesach, but they were tamei mason. But now you have zavs and metzoras. Is it possible that they would be chayav, that they would get in trouble? There would be a chiyuv karis. Right, tamei that goes into Beis Hamikdash, right? I believe it's a chiyuv karis. Yeah, it's the tumas mikdash v'kadoshim. So is it possible that they would be chayiv karis for that? So Talmud lomar v'shalchu min hamachne, that we send out of the camp. 1 second, what does it say? Okay. Fine. Anyways, fine. V'shalchu, the pasuk says we send out of the camp called sarua, metzoras, v'chol zavs, v'chol tamei lenefesh, and anybody with tumas hameis. B'shah shetmei meisim mishtalchin, so long as we have a situation where Tmei Mesim are not allowed in the Machne Shechina, Zav and Metzorai and Mishtalchin, well then Zavs and Metzoras are also not allowed wherever they're not allowed. Ein Tmei Mesim Mishtalchin, however, in a scenario where the Tmei Mesim are allowed in the Azara, like when the majority of Am Yisrael is Tmei Meis, they're allowed to offer the Korban Pesach in the Azara. Ein Zav and Metzorai and Mishtalchin, we don't have that chiyuv for Zav and Mitzrayim to be sent out of the camp. So we see, according to Rabbi Eliezer, that these requirements for Zavs and Metzoras and Tmei Mesim, these restrictions on them, only apply so long as kind of the system is intact. However, if one piece is kind of allowed and permitted, so then all the pieces become permitted. Therefore, in the context of majority of Am Yisrael being Tmei Mesim and offering the Korban Pesach, so in that case, they're allowed to offer the Korban Pesach. So if they're allowed to offer the Korban Pesach, also the Zavs and Metzoras. And similarly, when the Mishkan is packed up, and there's no longer a Machne Shechina, that the Tmei Mesim are not allowed in, well, also the Zavs and Metzoras, there's no longer a Machne Levi, a Machne Yisrael that they're not allowed in. According to Rabbi Eliezer, the Chacham, however, argue and say that even when the majority of Am Yisrael is Tmei Meis, Zavs and Metzoras not allowed into the Azara, and also the same would apply that even when the tabernacle is packed up and they're on the road, Zavs and Metzoras have the same restrictions according to the Chacham. So therefore, the Machlekes Habraisis, the one that says that the Zavs and Metzoras need to stay out, the restrictions apply, that's like the Chachamim, the opinion who says that when the tabernacle is packed up, or did we even have? Yeah. That when the tabernacle is packed up, Zavs and Metzoras are allowed in, that is Rabbi Eliezer. Friends, now we discuss where the Lechem Hapanim is prepared. It says the Mishnah, Achas Shtei Lechem v'Achas Lechem Hapanim. When it comes to Shtei Lechem, when it comes to Lechem Hapanim, Lishosan v'Arichosan, kneading them, shaping them, bachutz. That does not need to be in the Azar. V'Afyosan b'fnim, but baking them needs to be in the Azar. Ve'enan doches es HaShabbos, and baking the Shtei Lechem, baking the Lechem Hapanim, is not doche Shabbos, therefore it must be done before Shabbos, must be done on Friday. Rabbi Yehuda says, Rabbi Yehuda, kol ma'aseim b'fnim. Rabbi Yehuda says all of these activities, whether kneading, whether shaping, whether baking, all of that takes place in the Azor. Reb Shimon Omer says, Reb Shimon, La'olam avirogil lomar, Shtei alechem v'lechem hapanim. When it comes to Shtei alechem, when it comes to lechem hapanim, ksheris ba'azar v'ksheris b'beis pagi, sure. They're ksheris in the azara. Sure, if you want to knead and shape and bake in the azara, givaldig. You want to do it anywhere else in Yerushalayim? Also givaldig. Says the Gemara Agufa Kasha, this is a question because Omar, on the one hand you said, Lishasan varichasan, kneading and shaping, bachutz. That could be outside of the azar. Alma midas yavish lo niskadsha. That means that midas yavish, dry measures, the isaron that you're using to measure out the flour, lo niskadsha, are not kadosh to the extent that it can be the flour and can be kneaded and shaped. The dough could be shaped outside of the azar. They would not be, as Rashi says, they would not be possible biyotze. V'afiyosun b'fnim, but we're saying that you bake them in the azar. In the baking needs to be in the azar. Alma midas yavish niskadsha. So that means that the midas yavish does make things kadosh, therefore they have to be in the azar. The Gemara is going to reject this in a second for obvious reasons. Rabbi says, Rabbi huksha adam kosha shehu kosha b'kabarzel, a very hard person, very what's a better word than a hard person? A rugged person. I don't really know what the word is, but a very hard person who's hard like iron. Umanu, who is that? Rav Sheshes. He was struggling with this question. Tosfos says, it's a praise for Talmud Chacham. Any Talmud Chacham was not hard and strong like iron is not a Talmud Chacham. Rav Sheshes was strong like iron. But my kusha, what's the big question? I don't understand. I don't understand. Kneading and shaping are different than baking, and they require different instruments. You're not using your isaron when you're baking; you're using the oven when you're baking. So I don't understand. We're saying that the kneading and the shaping can be outside of the azar, and we're saying we're concluding from there that the isaron, the dry measure, is not going to be mekadesh the flour and the dough. Okay, that's the isaron measure is not mekadesh. Okay, that's fine. And we're saying that you have to bake it in the azar. Well, they're not using the isaron anymore. They're using the oven. Okay, so I guess we'll say that the oven is mekadesh. What's the question? The kneading and the shaping outside of the azar because the isaron is not mekadesh. The baking in the azar because the oven is mekadesh. Like what's the big deal? On my Ravit says Ravit. I skipped. So where am I? So lo mekadesh, tanu mekadesh. Fine. So elo ikasha ha kasha. Okay, this is the question. Vafayosan bifnim amaton mekadesh. Okay, from the fact that we're saying that the baking of the shtei lechem and the lechem hapanim, from the fact that the baking is in the azar, so amaton mekadesh. That means it's because the oven is mekadesh the bread. And because the oven is mekadesh, it has to be in Nazar. Ve'ein dochas is a Shabbos. However, we said that they're not dochas Shabbos. You see that's tricky. Why is it tricky? Well, we're saying that you can't bake the lechem hapanim, the shtei lechem on Shabbos. Well, let's talk about it's easier if we just talk about the lechem hapanim right now, because lechem hapanim would have switched out on Shabbos. So, baking the lechem hapanim is not going to be dochas Shabbos. So when are you going to do it? On Friday. But we're also saying that they have to be baked in the azara because the toner, the oven is mekadesh them. If the oven is mekadesh them, well then they will become possible belina. If sila belina, shouldn't they be? If sila belina, they should be possible belina. They should become possible belina. So right on the one hand we're saying that they have to be baked in the azara because the toner is mekadesh them, but then how could you bake them on Friday for Shabbos? They'll become possible belina because the ton is mekadesh them. Rava says, Rava, huksha adam kosher, shu kosher kebarzel, among Rav Sheshes, says Rava, that Rav Sheshes, and Adam kosher kebarzel, was troubled by this question. Rav Ashi is going to attempt to answer it, but we're going to reject that attempt, and the question will remain unresolved. Rav Ashi says, Rav Ashi, my kusha, what's the question? Dilma my bifnim b'makom's reason. What does it mean bifnim? It means that kohanim need to do the avodah. Okay, that's all it means. It doesn't mean that the Lechem Hapanim needs to be baked in the azara, and that the tanner is a klisharis. No. It doesn't is mekadosh. It doesn't mean that. It means that the baking needs to be done by the kohanim. That's all it means. But v'ha Ravashi barusahi, that which Ravashi says is not really a good solution, because manavshach I afia ba'ina's reason, because if the baking, if we're saying the baking doesn't need to be in azara, and that the tanner is not mekadosh the bread. Okay, fine. And we're saying that the baking needs to be done by kohanim. Okay, why? And if the baking needs to be done by the kohanim, so lisha ba'arichanami ba'ina's reason. Like, what's the difference between the baking? Right, we're saying that the tanner is not mekadosh, so there isn't that. So we're saying, okay, the baking needs to be done by the kohanim. What makes the baking any different than the kneading and the shaping? If the baking needs to be done by the kohanim, so the kneading and the shaping should also be done by the kohanim. Reason, and if from the other direction, if we're saying that the kneading and the shaping doesn't need kohanim, okay, well then afiyanami lo ba'inan's reason. Then the baking also shouldn't require kohanim. Like, why would one require kohanim and not the other? Let's not worry about Rav Ashi's answer here. And therefore, it sounds like it's a valid question. It's a valid question. If the kneading and shaping does not need to be in Nazar, that would be because the dry measures are not mekadosh. If the baking needs to be Nazar, it's because the oven is mekadosh, and therefore you want to make sure that the breads are being baked in Nazar. But if that's the case, that the oven is mekadosh, you should have to bake them on Shabbos. They should be docha Shabbos, because if you bake them before Shabbos, it would be possible belina. That question seems to be unresolved. Rabbi Yehuda Amar Kol Maaseh B'fnim V'chulei. We saw machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon, or Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon kind of were two more opinions here. There's really a three-way machlokes. Tanakama, who says that the kneading and the shaping can be outside of the azara, the baking is in the azara. Rabbi Yehuda says everything needs to be done in the azara. Rabbi Shimon says none of it needs to be done in the azara. Friends, I'm learning now Mishnayos Masechta Midos. And in Masechta Midos it describes that, in the Azara, not like the Mishkan was pretty bare bones. But in the Beis HaMikdash, Midos, I believe, is particularly describing the Bayis Sheni. So in the Azara, of course, there's a Beis HaMikdash, big structure, lots of rooms. So there were these little rooms that were kind of built into the wall of the Azara. One of them was called the Beis HaMoked. Now the Beis HaMoked had two entrances. You can enter into the Beis HaMoked from, right? The Beis HaMoked was on the northern side of the northern wall of the Azara. So like you'd go up for example, the northern Azara, like where the side of the Azara, like the behemoths were shechted and stuff. The north of the Azara, there was someone called Lishkas, called the Beis HaMoked. And the Beis HaMoked, you could enter in from within the Azara. You could walk into the Beis HaMoked from within the Azara. You can also walk into the Beis HaMoked from outside of the Azara. It was kind of split. The Beis HaMoked was split. One part of it was outside of the Azara, and one part of it was in the Azara. Right, depending on, it was built into the wall. Part of it was outside of the wall. Part of it was in the wall. Right, part of it was within the Azara. Part of it was outside of the Azara. And in the Beis HaMoked, there were 4 smaller rooms. One room in each of the 4 corners of the Beis HaMoked. And in the southeastern corner of the Beis HaMoked, that is to say in the Azara, was the Lishkas Lechem Hapanim, is where they would bake the Lechem Hapanim in the Azara. Very interesting. Anyways, back to our machlokas over here. So Rabbi Yehuda says that everything needs to be done in the Azara. Rabbi Shimon says everything could be done anywhere in Yerushalayim. Omer Babble says, Bar Kahana. V'shnei Mikra Echad Darshu. Rabbi Bar Kahana wants to argue that Reb Yehuda and Reb Shimon are darshaning the same pasuk. This pasuk is found in Sefer Shmuel Aleph. When King David is running away from King Saul, and he fatefully stops at Nov Ira Kohanim, and he asks if they have any food. And Achimelech, the Kohen Gadol, says, essentially, all we have is the Lechem Hapanim. And the following the Gemara now describes following dialogues that happen there. V'uderech chol afki ayom. Okay, v'uderech chol afki ayom yikdash bakeli. What does this mean? Rabbi Yehuda says, Rabbi Yehuda b'chol ashkochinu, that David HaMelech came to Nov on Friday, the ka'afule, and they were baking breads. They were baking the showbreads. Right? David HaMelech came to Nov on a Friday. They were baking, the Kohanim were baking the showbreads. Amar Lu, he says to them, how are you baking the showbreads? They're chol ka'afisule. You are baking the showbreads today, on Friday. Afki ayom yikdash bakeli. But since you're baking them, they are going to become kadosh. And if they become kadosh, ifsele belina, they're going to become pasul belina. So David HaMelech arrived at Nov Kohanim. He sees that they're baking the showbreads. He says, hey, how could you be baking the showbreads? It's Friday today. Baking the showbreads is going to be mikadesh, the lechem hapanim, which means that they can be pasul belina. By the time you're going to want to put them into the shulchan tomorrow, they're going to be pasul already. So we want to argue that that's how Rabbi Yehuda darshans the pasuk, to say that everything needs to be nazar because they become kadosh, and therefore that's why David HaMelech said that since they were kadosh, they'll be pasul belina. So Rabbi Yehuda says, look, you see, everything there becomes kadosh, and there that's why it would have to be done in that. Everything needs to be done in the azar. Reb Shimon says the opposite happened. B'Shabbos ashkochinu, that David HaMelech arrived at Nov Ira Kohanim on a Shabbos, and he saw that they were baking the showbreads on Shabbos, and he says, why are you baking the showbreads on Shabbos? You could just do it on Friday. They wouldn't be pasul belina. To Gavule, they were baking the showbreads on Shabbos. So Amar Lu, and he says to them, why are you doing this? Lo derech chol ba'isu l'me'ebdei? You should really do this on Friday. Midi tanur mekadesh, shulchanu du mekadesh. It's not like the oven is going to be mekadesh, the bread. Only when you put it in the shulchan does it become kadosh. And therefore, so David HaMelech says, why are you baking the showbreads today on Shabbos? You should bake it on Friday because they're not going to become kadosh, they're not going to become pasul belina. So you should really bake it from before Shabbos. So Reb Shimon would darshan the pasuk that way, to say that the baking of the bread is not going to be mekadesh, the showbreads is not going to be mekadesh the lechem hapanim, and therefore it doesn't have to be done in the azar. It can be done anywhere in Yerushalayim. Frag die Gemara, wait a second. Mimoses Omar, the b'shas afiyah ashka chinu. One second. We just said that David HaMelech showed up in Nov Ira Kohanim and they were busy baking the lechem hapanim. Impossible that he shows up and they're baking the lechem hapanim. How come? The pasuk says that the Achimelech vayitin lo yakoin kodesh ki lo haya sham lechem, that Achimelech gave to King David the lechem hapanim because there was no other breads. Kim lechem hapanim amusarim milifnei Hashem. All Achimelech had to give David HaMelech was lechem hapanim. So that means that the lechem hapanim was already baked. He showed up, he asked for food. Achimelech gave him lechem hapanim. They weren't baking the lechem hapanim now. Lechem hapanim was already baked. Right? As the pasuk says, what is the pasuk say? Lechem ki'im lechem hapanim amusarim lifnei Hashem lasum lechem chom b'yom ilakcho. That they were already replaced with the freshly baked breads, and this was the breads that they had already removed from the shulchan. So they weren't. They had already baked the breads. Elamai derech chol dekamar lehu. So then, what was that dialogue that that David HaMelech had with during the week? And so, this is what they said to King David: Leka lechem. Oh, we don't have any bread. Ki'im lechem hapanim hamusar milifnei Hashem. All we have is the lechem hapanim. That's all we have to offer you. Amalu, and he says to them, Lo mibaya hai. Certainly, this lechem hapanim that you're offering me, that has already been removed from the shulchan. They came to nofak le mimeila derech cholhu. That this lechem hapanim that you're offering me, that since they've already been removed from the shulchan, and therefore they've had a shas heter la kohanim, they've been removed from the shulchan, the frankincense must have been burnt, and therefore they have these lechem hapanim as a shas heter la kohanim, the kohanim are allowed to eat it. And as the first Mishnah Masechta Me'ilah says, according to the opinion of Rabbi Yeshua, that any, I think we assume this way, that once a korban is at a shas heter la kohanim, that it becomes mutter for the kohanim to eat it, it no longer has a din Me'ilah. So David HaMelech says, certainly the lechem hapanim that you are offering me, that has already been removed from the shulchan and can now be eaten by the kohanim, certainly I will accept that. It no longer has a din me'ilah. It's considered chol, I can accept it. Ela afilu ha'eich nami de'ayom yikdash bakeli, but even the other lechem hapanim that just today you placed on the shulchan, Havuli, I would like those as well, to eat them, misukanu, because I am sick. So Rashi says, She'achazo bulmis. He got sick with bulmis sickness. Utam she'achazo bulmis, machilin also, ad she'yoru eino afilu b'yom HaKippurim, that we can feed somebody with bulmis sickness even on Yom Kippur. So he says, look, because I'm sick with bulmis, I'm asking for all the bread you got. All the lechem hapanim you got, the lechem hapanim that was removed today, but even the lechem hapanim that was placed on the shulchan today. So therefore, Rab Abu Bar Kahana wanted to say that Rabbi Yehuda and Reb Shimon are darshaning this pasuk about David HaMelech showing up and Novi HaKohanim, and they were busy baking the breads, and he says, either it would be possible belina, not possible belina, the baking is mekadesh, not mekadesh. We said no. The breads were already baked at that time. So Rabbi Yehuda, Reb Shimon, the Gemara Plige, they are simply arguing about traditions. That Rabbi Yehuda's tradition is that, right, as Rashi says, Mar Gomer le Meirabe de Tanur Mekadesh, Mar Gomer le Delo Mekadesh. Right? That Rabbi Yehuda had a tradition that the Tanur is Mekadesh, that the baking of the Shtei Lechem is going to be, and the Lechem Hapanim is going to be Mekadesh, the breads, and therefore they have to be done in the Azar. And Reb Shimon had a tradition that they're not Mekadesh the bread, and they can be done anywhere in Yerushalayim. Dekanami, you can also infer this. Dekatani, that it says in the Mishnah, Reb Shimon Omer says, Reb Shimon, La'olam ave rogil lomar. Reb Shimon's not saying a psak, rather he says something interesting. La'olam ave rogil lomar, you should say, Shtei Alechem v'lechem hapanim ksheris, ba'azara v'ksheris abeis pagi, that the lechem and the Shtei Alechem can be, what did I say? That the lechem hapanim and the Shtei Alechem are kosher in the Azar, but also kosher anywhere in Yerushalayim. And he doesn't just say like, this is the opinion. He says you should say the following. I guess it's not kind of his own opinion, but it's a tradition that he heard. Shema Mina. So we see that they're arguing about about what they've heard. They're not darshaning. It's not an original drasha from a pasuk of Rabbi Yehuda and Reb Shimon. Rather, Rabbi Yehuda had this tradition. Reb Shimon had that tradition that they were sharing in the Mishnah. Friends, that was Daf Tzadiyeh, Daf 95 of Masechta Menachos. Friends, we learned about the status of the Lechem Hapanim while on the road. And where we landed with that was that bread that is on the Shulchan. The Torah in Parshas Bamidbar refers to the bread that is on the Shulchan, that we leave it on the Shulchan, and we take a beged tcheles and we cover the Shulchan. We wrap the Shulchan with that tcheles, with the bread still on the Shulchan. And that bread is referred to as lechem tomid, that it remains kosher on the Shulchan while on the road. Bread that has been removed from the shulchan on Shabbos to be eaten by the Kohanim. So then, once they hit the road and they pack up the mishkan, then memele, that bread, the lechem hapanim, becomes pasol biyotze. We discussed the status of zavs and metzoras while on the road. We saw that it's a machlokas. Rabbi Eliezer says that once the mishkan is packed up, there's no longer effectively machne shechina. So then kind of the statuses of all the camps and who's allowed into what camps kind of falls away, and the zavs and metzoras are allowed into the camp at that point until they reach their next destination and the mishkan is reestablished and machne shechina is reestablished. The Chachamim say they are nonetheless not allowed into the camp. They still have to stay outside of where they have to stay outside of. And finally, where the Lechem Hapanim is prepared. According to the Chacham, the Lechem Hapanim is kneaded and shaped outside of the Zara, but they need to be baked in the Azar. Rabbi Yehuda says that they need to be kneaded, shaped, and baked in the Azara. Rabbi Shimon says they can be kneaded, shaped, and baked anywhere in Jerusalem. Friends, that was Daf 95 of Masechet Menachos. Hope you enjoyed. Have a great day. Peace.